I was halfway through a plate of lukewarm spaghetti when it happened. Thursday nights were Claire's work dinner nights, a regular thing for her and her team at the advertising agency. Normally, I didn't think twice about it. She'd come home late, complain about how Greg from sales dominated the conversation, and we'd move on. But this Thursday was different. It started with a phone call, around 7:30. The landline, of all things, because her cell must have been dead. I almost didn't pick up. Who calls a landline these days? When I did, it was her colleague Sheila on the other end, her voice dripping with casual politeness. "Hey, Steve. Is Claire around?" She forgot her coat at the restaurant. For a moment, I didn't answer. My fork hovered mid-air, the words not quite sinking in. "Restaurant?" "Yes, the steakhouse downtown," Sheila said, like it was the most obvious thing in the world. She left in such a hurry. Hope she's okay. A dozen thoughts crowded my mind, none of them making sense. Claire didn't eat steak. And her work dinners weren't at steakhouses, they were at a boring chain cafe where the team drowned in bad coffee and endless refills. Yeah, she's fine," I lied. "I'll let her know." I hung up, heart pounding, my brain racing through the puzzle pieces. Sheila's tone wasn't suspicious, just friendly, but something didn't add up. Claire hadn't said anything about changing plans, and there was no text about a fancy dinner downtown. I told myself not to jump to conclusions, but the rest of my meal sat untouched. By 9 o'clock, I'd convinced myself it was nothing. Maybe I misheard Sheila. Maybe Claire had popped into the steakhouse to grab a drink with a friend. But when Claire finally walked through the door at 9:45, something was off. Her hair was disheveled, not messy, but different, like she'd taken extra care to fluff it up. Her lipstick wasn't smudged, but it was fresher than I remembered from this morning. She smelled faintly of perfume she didn't usually wear. "How was the dinner?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Oh, same old," she replied breezily, heading straight for the kitchen without stopping to kiss me hello. Greg was a nightmare, as usual. I nodded, watching her rummage through the fridge. She poured herself a glass of wine, then leaned against the counter like nothing was amiss. But her eyes didn't meet mine. It wasn't until she went upstairs to shower that I noticed it. A receipt crumpled on the edge of the counter. I wasn't snooping, it was just there. It had the steakhouse logo stamped across the top. And it wasn't for her team dinner. It was for 2 people. 1 steak, 1 fish, and a bottle of red wine. That's when I realized, the woman I loved, trusted, and built my life with, was hiding something. And I wasn't going to rest until I figured out what. The moment I saw the receipt, it felt like a live wire had been dropped in my chest. 2 people. Steak and fish. A bottle of wine. This wasn't a casual dinner with colleagues. It wasn't Greg boring her to tears over coffee. This was deliberate. Intimate. I folded the receipt neatly, slid it into my wallet, and sat down at the kitchen table. My hands were steady, but my mind raced like it was trying to keep up with a speeding train. Claire had been upstairs for nearly 15 minutes, the sound of the shower running masking any noise. Part of me wanted to march right up, fling the receipt at her, and demand answers. But I stopped myself. I had no proof, no real proof. A receipt wasn't evidence of an affair. It could have been dinner with a client, a friend, or anyone. But if that was true, why lie? Why not tell me she'd gone somewhere else? Why the faint cloud of perfume she only wore on special occasions? Why the jittery way she avoided eye contact when she walked in the door? When she finally came downstairs, her hair still damp, she seemed lighter. More relaxed. She settled on the couch with her wine, scrolling through her phone as if nothing was wrong. "How's Sheila?" I asked, testing the waters. Claire glanced up, her brow furrowing. "Sheila?" "Yeah, she called earlier." "Something about you forgetting your coat at the steakhouse?" For a fraction of a second, her expression froze. It was subtle, but I caught it. Then she laughed, a soft, casual laugh that felt just a little too forced. "Oh, right. That's where we ended up tonight, she said, waving a hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Last-minute change of plans. Ah, I said, keeping my tone neutral. Nice place. She nodded, already back to her phone. I watched her, waiting for her to offer more, to fill in the gaps. But she didn't. She didn't say who she was with, why she'd been in such a hurry, or why I hadn't been given even a courtesy text. The rest of the night passed in a haze. We watched some mindless show on Netflix, but I didn't hear a word of it. Every laugh, every glance, every casual brush of her hand against mine felt calculated, like she was performing a version of herself that she thought I wanted to see. I couldn't sleep that night. Claire dozed beside me, her breathing deep and even, while I lay there staring at the ceiling, the receipt burning a hole in my wallet. By 2 a.m., I'd made up my mind. I needed to know the truth. The next morning, I left for work like usual, but instead of heading straight to the office, I drove downtown to the steakhouse. It was early, barely 9, but I figured it was worth a shot. The restaurant was closed, but a delivery truck was parked out front, and a man in a chef's jacket was unloading boxes of produce. "Excuse me," I said, walking over. "Do you work here?" "Yeah," he replied, wiping his hands on his apron. "I was here last night," I lied. "Had dinner with my wife. She left her coat. Any chance it's in the lost and found?" He shrugged and gestured toward the side door. "Talk to Lisa. She's the manager." Lisa turned out to be a sharp-eyed woman in her late 40s, with a no-nonsense demeanor. I repeated my story, adding a few details to make it more convincing. "We keep lost items in the back," she said, leading me to a small storage room. "What's the coat look like?" I described a generic black jacket, knowing it was unlikely Claire had actually left anything behind. Lisa rifled through the rack but came up empty. "Sorry, nothing like that here." "That's okay," I said, feigning disappointment. "By the way, do you remember seeing us?" We were sitting in the back, near the windows. Lisa frowned, thinking. "Last night? Let me check." She disappeared into the office, and I waited, my heart pounding. When she returned, she was holding a tablet, her finger scrolling through what I assumed was the reservation log. "Here we go," she said. 2 people, 7:30. Names under Claire. I forced a smile. "That's her." "Thanks." "Sure thing," Lisa said, already turning away. I walked out of the restaurant feeling like I'd been punched in the gut. 2 people. No colleagues. No team dinner. Just Claire and someone else. At work, I could barely focus. I kept replaying the scene in my head, imagining her sitting there, laughing, sipping wine, leaning in close to whoever was across from her. By lunchtime, I couldn't take it anymore. I called the steakhouse again, asking to speak to Lisa. "Hey, it's me again," I said. "One last question, was the table paid with a card? I might need to dispute the charge with my bank." Lisa didn't seem suspicious. "Hang on," she said, and I heard her typing. "It was a Visa," she said after a moment. "Thanks." Claire and I both used Visa cards, but hers was linked to our joint account. It only took a few minutes to log in and pull up the transaction history. Sure enough, there it was, $164.52 at the steakhouse, paid with her card. When I got home that night, I wasn't sure how to act. Claire greeted me with a kiss, her smile warm, her demeanor effortless. But I couldn't stop myself from studying her, searching for cracks in her performance. We had dinner, watched TV, and went to bed like usual. But as I lay there in the dark, listening to her steady breathing, I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't imagining this. Something was going on, and I was going to find out exactly what. The next morning started like any other. Claire was in the kitchen, pouring herself coffee, still in her robe, while I stood by the sink rinsing my mug. She hummed softly to herself, a tune she probably didn't even realize she was humming, like someone completely at peace. I wasn't. "Do you have plans after work?" I asked casually, watching her face carefully for any reaction. She paused for a moment, her hand tightening just slightly around the coffee pot. No, why? Just thought maybe we could grab dinner. I feel like we haven't gone out in a while. Her smile was automatic, but it didn't reach her eyes. That sounds nice. Let me see how my day goes. That answer told me everything I needed to know. She wasn't committing. She was leaving room for something or someone else. At work, I could barely sit still. My stomach churned with a mix of anger, betrayal, and anticipation. Every detail, every moment over the past few weeks began connecting in my mind like pieces of a puzzle. The night she came home late. The extra care she put into her appearance. The faint whiff of perfume that wasn't hers. By lunchtime, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to wait for more proof, more evidence. I already knew the truth. What I needed now was to make her admit it. I left work early, stopping at home just long enough to grab the steakhouse receipt from my wallet and drop my things. Claire's car was in the driveway, which meant she was already home. She was in the living room, curled up on the couch with her laptop. The moment I walked in, she looked up, her smile as bright and practiced as ever. "You're home early," she said. "Yeah. Thought I'd surprise you," I replied, sitting down in the armchair across from her. She closed her laptop, setting it aside. "Nice. How was work?" "Fine." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the receipt, holding it up between two fingers. "But I've been meaning to ask you about this." Her smile faltered. She stared at the receipt like it was a live grenade. "What's that?" "You tell me." For a moment, she didn't move. Then she reached out, taking it from my hand, her face carefully blank. Her eyes scanned the paper, and I saw the exact moment she realized she was caught. "I can explain," she said quickly, her voice a little too loud, too defensive. "Then explain." She hesitated, her gaze darting around the room like she was searching for an escape. "It's not what you think, Steve." "Then what is it?" I leaned forward, my tone calm but razor-sharp. "Because it looks a hell of a lot like you had dinner with someone. And it wasn't your team." Claire opened her mouth, then closed it again. I waited, giving her the space to speak, but the longer the silence stretched, the angrier I became. "Just tell me the truth," I said, my voice hard. "Who were you with?" Her shoulders slumped, and for a moment, she looked genuinely remorseful. "It was a client," she said softly. I laughed, a bitter sound that filled the room. "Don't lie to me, Claire. I called the restaurant. There was no reservation under your company. Just yours." Her eyes widened in panic. She hadn't expected me to dig that deep. "Steve, it's not what it looks like. Stop lying." I snapped, standing up so fast the chair scraped against the floor. "Who was it?" She flinched, her hands gripping the edge of the couch. "Okay, fine," she said, her voice shaking. "It was Mark." Mark. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. Mark was her coworker, someone she'd mentioned a few times in passing. I'd never thought much of him, just another name in her office anecdotes. "And what, exactly, were you doing with Mark at a steakhouse, on your team dinner night?" I asked, my voice icy. She hesitated again, her hands trembling. "We were just talking. That's all." "Just talking?" I repeated, my anger rising. "Is that why you lied to me? Why you didn't tell me you were going there? Why you didn't mention it when I asked about your night?" "I didn't lie," she protested, but her voice wavered. "I just didn't tell you." "Not telling me is lying, Claire." I shot back. "You hid this from me. Why?" Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. But then I remembered the receipt, the lies, the careful way she'd covered her tracks. "Because I knew you'd react like this," she said, her voice breaking. "You always overthink things. It was just dinner, Steve. Nothing happened." I stared at her, my chest heaving. "If it was just dinner, why didn't you tell me? Why hide it? Why sneak around?" She didn't answer. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. I could see the guilt in her eyes, the way her hands fidgeted nervously in her lap. "Do you love him?" I asked finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "No," she said immediately, her eyes wide with horror. "Steve, I love you. I swear. It was a mistake. I needed someone to talk to. That's all it was." I wanted to believe her. God, I wanted to believe her. But the evidence said otherwise. "You needed someone to talk to, so you went to a steakhouse with a bottle of wine?" I said, my voice laced with disbelief. "Do you think I'm stupid, Claire?" "No," she said again, shaking her head. "I didn't mean for it to happen. It got out of hand. I felt the air leave my lungs, like I'd been sucker punched. So something did happen." She didn't respond, but the look on her face said it all. I stood there, staring at the woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd built my life with, and realized I didn't recognize her anymore. "I need you to leave," I said finally, my voice cold. "What?" she whispered, her eyes filling with fresh tears. "I can't do this right now," I said, turning away. "Just go. I need space." Without another word, she stood up, grabbed her keys, and left. As the door closed behind her, the weight of what had just happened settled over me like a crushing wave. I didn't know what was next, but I knew one thing for sure: my life would never be the same again. When Claire left, the silence in the house was unbearable. I could still feel the echoes of her words hanging in the air, like a bad smell that wouldn't dissipate. My mind was racing, my anger swelling and hardening into something sharper, something more focused. I wasn't just hurt, I was furious. I spent hours pacing the house, replaying the confrontation over and over in my head. Her excuses, her lies, they all pointed to one thing: she thought I was a fool. She thought she could string me along, that I'd accept her half-truths and denials, and we'd somehow move on. But I wasn't about to let her walk all over me, not after this. By the time the clock struck midnight, I knew what I had to do. If Claire thought she could betray me and walk away unscathed, she had another thing coming. I wasn't going to let her get away with it. The first thing I did was gather all the evidence I had. The receipt, the reservations I'd confirmed with the steakhouse, her weird behavior over the past few weeks, it all painted a picture, but I needed more. If I was going to take her down, I needed to be thorough. I pulled out my laptop and began digging. Claire's social media accounts were the first stop, though she rarely posted anything personal. Still, I scrolled through every photo, every comment, every like, looking for anything out of place. Nothing stood out, but I wasn't surprised. Claire wasn't stupid, she knew how to keep things hidden. Next, I checked our shared cloud storage. Claire was meticulous about backing up her phone, which meant I had access to months' worth of photos, videos, and documents. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. Tucked away in a folder labeled work stuff were dozens of photos of her and Mark. At first glance, they looked innocent: group shots from office parties, candid moments during team meetings, but the more I looked, the more obvious it became. In almost every photo, they were standing just a little too close, their smiles just a little too intimate. And then there was the video. It was buried deep in the folder, almost as if she'd forgotten it was there. When I opened it, my stomach churned. It was a short clip of Claire and Mark sitting in a booth at some dimly lit restaurant. She was laughing, her hand resting on his arm, while he leaned in closer than any coworker had a right to. I stared at the screen, my hands clenched into fists. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was real. By the time the sun came up, I had everything I needed. Screenshots of their messages, copies of the photos and video, a timeline of her late nights and unexplained absences, it was all there, laid out like a case file. But gathering evidence wasn't enough. I wanted her to feel the weight of what she'd done, to experience the humiliation she'd tried to spare herself by lying. The next step was reaching out to the people who needed to know. Claire's parents were first on the list. They'd always treated me like a son, and I wanted them to hear the truth from me, not some twisted version Claire would try to spin. I called her father, Jim, and asked if we could talk. He agreed without hesitation, and within an hour, I was sitting in their living room, the evidence spread out on the coffee table. Jim's face turned red as I walked him and his wife, Linda, through everything. Linda sat in stunned silence, her hand covering her mouth, while Jim stared at the photos with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "I can't believe this," he muttered, shaking his head. "That woman." "Your daughter," Linda interrupted, her voice trembling. "Don't talk about her like she's a stranger." Jim didn't respond, but his jaw tightened. "I thought you should know," I said, standing up. "I'm not asking you to pick sides, but I can't stay silent about this." Linda nodded, tears streaming down her face. "Thank you, Steve. We'll talk to her." Next, I turned my attention to Mark. It didn't take long to find him online. His Facebook profile was public, and he'd tagged himself in enough photos to leave a digital breadcrumb trail. I sent him a private message, attaching a few of the photos I'd found. "Meet me," I wrote. "Or these go public." He replied within minutes, agreeing to meet me at a coffee shop downtown. When I walked in, he was already there, sitting nervously at a corner table. He looked younger than I'd expected, with the kind of smug confidence that made me want to punch him. "Steve," he said, standing up and extending a hand. I ignored it, sitting down across from him. "Let's skip the pleasantries, Mark. I know what's been going on." His face paled. "Look, man, I don't know what Claire told you, but..." "She didn't tell me anything," I snapped, cutting him off. "I found out on my own. And I'm not here to listen to your excuses." Mark swallowed hard, his hands fidgeting on the table. "This is how it's going to go," I said, leaning in. "You're going to transfer departments, or quit entirely. I don't care which. But you're not going to work with Claire anymore." "And if I don't?" he asked, his voice shaky. "Then everyone in your office is going to see these," I said, sliding the photos across the table. His eyes widened, and I could see the panic setting in. He knew I wasn't bluffing. "Fine," he said after a long pause. "I'll transfer." "Good." I stood up, grabbing the photos. "And stay the hell away from my wife." When I got home that evening, Claire was waiting for me. Her eyes were red and puffy, and she looked like she hadn't slept. "Steve, we need to talk," she said softly. "You're damn right we do," I replied, my voice cold. She started to speak, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Not yet. You're going to listen first." I told her everything about the evidence I'd gathered, the conversations I'd had with her parents and Mark, the ultimatum I'd given him. She sat there, silent, tears streaming down her face, as I laid it all out. When I was done, I stood up. "Pack a bag," I said. "You're staying with your parents tonight." "Steve, please," she begged. "Let's talk about this." "I don't want to talk to you right now," I said, my voice firm. "Go." She left without another word, and for the first time in weeks, the house felt quiet. Peaceful. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear: I wasn't going to let her destroy me. The house was still as I sat at the dining table, staring at the empty seat across from me. I'd barely touched my dinner, the cold leftovers sitting untouched on the plate in front of me. Claire was at her parents' house, where I had told her to go 2 nights ago, and the silence in the house was both a relief and a torment. Every creak of the floorboards or groan of the old pipes reminded me of her absence, of the life that had unraveled in a matter of days. I knew she'd want to come back eventually. That was the problem I needed to solve tonight. When my phone buzzed on the table, I didn't need to look to know it was her. I'd ignored a dozen messages and missed calls from her since the confrontation, needing the time to think, to decide how this story ended. But tonight, I was ready. I picked up the phone and read the message. "Steve, please. I need to talk to you. Just once. Tell me when and where, and I'll be there." I stared at the screen, considering my options. I could keep ignoring her, drag this out, but that wasn't going to fix anything. If this was going to end, I needed to face it head on. After a few moments, I typed a response: "Tomorrow. 7 p.m. At the house." The next day dragged. Every hour felt like an eternity as I worked through emails and spreadsheets, trying to focus on the mundane routines of life. By the time I got home, the sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the walls. I poured myself a glass of water, set it on the table, and waited. At exactly 7 p.m., I heard her car pull into the driveway. Moments later, the front door opened, and she stepped inside. Claire looked like hell. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her face was pale and drawn, as if she hadn't slept. She was holding a small overnight bag, her hands trembling as she clutched the strap. "Hi," she said softly, her voice hesitant. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I gestured for her to sit down at the table. She obeyed, lowering herself into the chair across from me, her eyes scanning my face for any sign of what I was feeling. For a moment, we sat in silence, the air between us heavy. Finally, she spoke. "Steve, I'm so sorry," she said, her voice breaking. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you. But I need you to know that I love you. I've always loved you." I leaned back in my chair, studying her. "You've got a funny way of showing it." Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "I know. I don't have any excuses for what I did. I was selfish and stupid, and I've ruined everything. But I want to fix it. I'll do whatever it takes to make this right." I shook my head. "It's not that simple, Claire. You didn't just make a mistake, you made a choice. Over and over again. You chose to lie to me, to betray me. How am I supposed to trust you after that?" She flinched as if I'd slapped her, but I kept going. "You knew exactly what you were doing," I said. "You hid it. You lied. You snuck around, thinking I'd never find out. And now you want me to believe it didn't mean anything? That it was just a mistake?" Her hands twisted in her lap, her knuckles white. "It didn't mean anything," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I swear. I was just lost. I felt like we were drifting apart, and I didn't know how to fix it. He was there, and I made a terrible choice. But it wasn't about him. It was about me, and my insecurities, and my failures. Not you." "Not me?" I asked, my voice rising. "You think this isn't about me? You think it doesn't matter that you tore our life apart because you couldn't figure out your own problems?" "I'm not saying that," she said quickly, her eyes wide with panic. "I know it's my fault, Steve. All of it. And I'll do whatever it takes to make it right. Therapy, counseling, whatever you want. Just tell me how to fix this, and I'll do it." I looked at her, my chest tight with a mix of anger, sadness, and something else I couldn't quite name. For all her tears and apologies, there was a part of me that wanted to believe her. That wanted to forgive her, to put this behind us and start over. But I couldn't. "It's not that simple," I said, my voice heavy. "You broke something, Claire. Something I don't know if we can fix." Her face crumpled, and for a moment, she looked completely lost. "Please, Steve," she whispered. "Don't give up on us. We've been through so much together. Don't throw it all away." I stood up, pacing the room. "You're the one who threw it away, Claire. You're the one who decided that whatever we had wasn't enough. You're the one who lied to my face and expected me to just accept it." She buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. I stopped pacing, turning to face her. "I don't know if I can forgive you," I said quietly. "I don't know if I even want to try." Her head snapped up, her eyes red and desperate. "You don't mean that," she said, her voice trembling. "You love me. I know you do. Please, Steve, give me a chance to prove to you that I can change. That we can fix this." I stared at her, the woman I'd loved for so many years, and felt the weight of everything we'd lost pressing down on me. "I need time," I said finally. "I need space to figure out what I want and what's best for me. And right now, that means being apart." She nodded slowly, her tears falling unchecked. "Okay," she said. "I understand. Take all the time you need. Just, don't shut me out completely." please." I didn't respond. Instead, I walked to the door and opened it. "Goodbye, Claire," I said softly. She stood up, hesitating for a moment before walking past me and out the door. When it closed behind her, I sank into the nearest chair, the weight of the conversation crashing down on me. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe again. The days that followed were both quiet and suffocating. Claire stayed at her parents' house, respecting my request for space, though she called every couple of days to check in. I didn't always answer. Most of the time, I let her calls go to voicemail, unable to deal with the wave of emotions hearing her voice stirred up. Inside the house, I tried to carry on as if life hadn't been flipped upside down. I went to work, came home, and went through the motions, but nothing felt real. Every corner of the house reminded me of her, of us, our life together, now tainted by lies and betrayal. The bed felt too big, the living room too empty, and the silence too loud. One evening, about 2 weeks after the confrontation, Claire's father called me. Jim wasn't the kind of man to mince words, and when I answered, his voice was as gruff and direct as ever. "Steve, it's Jim," he said. "Do you have a minute?" "Sure," I replied, though I wasn't sure I wanted to hear what he had to say. "Look, I don't want to stick my nose where it doesn't belong," he began, "but Claire's been a wreck since you sent her to our house. Linda and we've been trying to support her, but, well, I think you two need to have another conversation. This limbo isn't good for either of you." I sighed, leaning back against the kitchen counter. "Jim, I appreciate you looking out for her, but I'm not sure there's anything left to talk about. She made her choices." "I know," he said, his tone softening. "And I'm not excusing what she did. What she did was wrong, no two ways about it. But she loves you, Steve. She's been saying it every day since this all blew up. Maybe it's worth hearing her out one more time." I didn't respond right away. Part of me wanted to tell him it was none of his business, but another part of me, the part that still felt the faintest flicker of something for Claire, knew he was right. "Thanks, Jim," I said finally. "I'll think about it." That night, I stared at my phone for hours before finally texting Claire. "Let's talk. Tomorrow. Noon. At the park near the lake." The next day, I arrived at the park early, the brisk air biting at my skin as I sat on a bench overlooking the water. The lake was calm, its surface broken only by the occasional ripple from a passing duck. I hadn't been here in years, not since Claire and I used to take walks along the trail, back when life felt simple. When she arrived, she looked nervous, clutching her coat tightly around her as she approached. She sat down beside me, leaving a careful gap between us. "Thank you for meeting me," she said quietly. I nodded, not looking at her. "What do you want to say, Claire?" She hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. "I know I've said it before, but I'm so sorry, Steve. I hate what I've done to us, to you. I hate myself for it." I stayed silent, letting her continue. "I know I've hurt you in ways I can't take back," she said, her voice trembling. "I know I broke your trust, and I don't expect you to forgive me overnight. But I need you to know that I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make this right. Counseling, therapy, whatever you want. Just tell me how to fix this." I turned to look at her, really look at her, for the first time in weeks. She looked small, fragile, like she was barely holding herself together. And for a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. "Claire, I don't think this is something you can just fix," I said, my voice steady. "You didn't just make a mistake, you made a choice. You chose to lie, to betray me, to risk everything we built together for, what? A few moments of attention?" Her eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "It wasn't like that. I wasn't thinking straight, Steve. I was insecure, and I let myself believe things that weren't true. That maybe you didn't love me anymore, or that I wasn't enough. But it was all in my head. I see that now." I sighed, looking back at the water. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Claire. And even if I could, I don't know if I want to." The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant sounds of children playing on the other side of the park. "So, what now?" she asked, her voice barely audible. I took a deep breath, my chest tightening with the weight of the decision I'd been wrestling with since the moment I found that receipt. I think we need to go our separate ways, I said finally. I don't think we can come back from this, Claire. There's too much damage. She let out a shaky breath, tears streaming down her face. Is that really what you want? No, I admitted. But it's what I need. I can't live like this, constantly wondering if I can trust you, if you're telling me the truth. That's no way to live. She nodded slowly, wiping her tears with the back of her hand. Okay, she whispered. If that's what you need, I'll respect it. We sat there for a long time, neither of us speaking. When she finally stood up to leave, she hesitated, looking down at me with a mixture of sadness and something else, gratitude, maybe. Thank you, Steve, she said softly. For everything. I nodded, watching as she walked away, her figure growing smaller until she disappeared from view. In the weeks that followed, I started the process of untangling our lives. The divorce was amicable as it could be under the circumstances, and Claire moved back in with her parents while I stayed in the house. It wasn't easy. There were days when the loneliness felt unbearable, when the weight of everything I'd lost threatened to crush me. But there were also moments of clarity, moments when I felt a sense of relief knowing I'd done what was right for me.